the approval of the country's proposed budget facing uncertainty, with political parties represented in the Government of National Unity at odds over some of Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana's proposals. The proposed 1 percentage point VAT increase over 2 years has been one of the biggest bones of contention. But Godongwana has argued that's not necessary. Newzroom Africa's Michelle Craig is live for us now from Parliament. With only hours to go, Michelle, it's a story that we're writing almost hourly because there are so many twists and turns in the lead up to this budget. Not altogether unexpected. You have a GNU and they've got to find agreement, find each other, which they've been struggling to do over the last couple of weeks. Tell us what you've learned from your position this morning.
Certainly, Iman, good morning to you and to our viewers once again from our live position here outside the Dome. This is where that joint session of Parliament will be taking place this afternoon at 2 o'clock. And it follows what was a marathon meeting yesterday to adopt the fiscal framework for budget 2025. The budget delivered almost a month after its initial date on the 12th of March. And so it does have a whole range of implications for when the VAT increase comes into play. And also, of course, don't forget, if things don't go as planned today, it does mean that we are still working on last year's budget, which does hamstring government somewhat in terms of just exactly what expenditure is possible. We know that the EFF is holding a briefing, or rather it's issued a statement insofar as challenging the legality of how this budget was adopted yesterday. In fact, we will speak to them in just a few moments from our live position here. And then the MK party at 11 o'clock this morning is going to be holding a briefing as well along the lines of its response to the budget. We know that the ANC has gone outside of the Government of National Unity to try and get some agreement on this budget, even talking to Action SA. Critics of Action SA telling us that Action SA has done an about turn from its initial position on the VAT increase. You can see it's very, very windy here in Cape Town. Winds of change, perhaps. Let's speak to APSA's Simpiwe Letlojane. Simpiwe, it's great to talk to you. And the market's opening just a short while ago. 1892 was the rand dollar the last time I checked. Is that right?
I think it's more or less anchored a little bit closer to the 1850 mark. It has crept up a little bit from some of the strengths that we have seen recently. So it's currently trading around 1859. And the dollar index is more or less moving a bit sideways. So it is speaking to a little bit of potentially some nervousness in markets in and around, what we anticipate in respect to the budget. But if we also look at bond yields, which are a bit of a more better proxy for, sentiment on, the budget and sentiment around government implementation and reforms, those have been fairly stable over the past couple of weeks, even after, the delivery of the budget. So markets have taken quite a neutral stance in terms of the overall budget. But of course, we'll see if there aren't any potential drags on the overall process.
Even when the budget was delayed in February.
Yeah, so bond yields have been fairly stable. I mean, the rand itself has not necessarily shot, blown out. So we're not seeing the rand trading in excess of 19 USD. We're seeing it anchored closer to the 18 mark. And bond yields themselves have also been fairly stable. And I really think the main reason for that is if you're looking at the overall budget, debt to GDP levels still forecasted to peak in this particular fiscal year and potentially begin to come down from there onwards. So a lot of those speaking to quite a lot of positivity. And of course, from a reform perspective as well, there's been quite a lot of green shoots. Energy supply has significantly improved, even though we did see a little bit of load shedding earlier. But if we're comparing that to what we had, a couple of months ago, a couple of quarters ago, that was much more significantly negative. And of course, on the Transnet side, we're seeing quite a lot of talks around private-public partnerships that are going to bring about the efficiencies needed there. So quite a lot of positives in terms of just the overall government direction on reforms.
Look, there's a lot of politics around the budget, and you're from APSA, so we won't get into the political analysis around what's going on, but it was expected, and I'm sure that the markets must in some way be looking to the functioning of the Government of National Unity. I mean, is that an issue when we talk about market sentiment, the fact that the DA and the ANC are the two big players in the Government of National Unity, and that partnership now looks to be in question.
Yeah, look, I mean, it definitely does raise a lot of concern and a bit of uncertainty, especially given just how long this has been dragging. We certainly wouldn't want to see it drag any further, and we wouldn't want this to be the order of the day in terms of reform measures where, there's gridlocks and drags, because it creates quite a lot of uncertainty around, things that need to happen from a government perspective. And we do think that the government of national unity does have its importance and does have a role to play, especially in an environment where we don't have majority. So when you have some sort of unity around that, it creates a little bit of certainty, a little bit of unified direction around policies and the implementation. And the implementation is quite key in terms of what we really, really want from government going forward, which is really to make sure that all of the things and the promises that they've been talking about actually begin to filter through into the economy.
Simpiwe, a great pleasure talking to you. Thanks for joining us on what is an incredibly windy day here outside of Parliament. In fact, Iman, if you'll give us just a moment, we're actually going to bring in the EFF's Sinawo Thambo. Sinawo, thanks for coming on. I want to just bring up, you can come a bit closer if you wouldn't mind. I want to just bring up the statement from the EFF, which is to the Speaker of the National Assembly and to the Chairperson of the Standing Committee on Finance. So the top line there is a request for the withdrawal of the report for the 2025 fiscal framework. I mean, is that possible at such a late stage, given that we already had a postponed budget and, with the adoption of the fiscal framework yesterday, we essentially have 30 days until that March 1st deadline? May 1st.
Look, I think it should be possible because there were a lot of procedural processes that were not followed appropriately in the Standing Committee on Finance meeting yesterday, which I was a part of. Because first and foremost, the meeting was supposed to come out with a clear statement as to whether we accept or seek to amend the fiscal framework of 2025, and that is the Money Bills Amendment Procedure and Other Related Matters Act that enjoins upon us to do so. So there was a failure to do that, and we raised it consistently in the beginning of the meeting that we can't engage in a process of amending a committee report without stating clearly whether we accept or amend the fiscal framework. So there are two separate documents here. There's the fiscal framework and there's a committee report which reflects on engagements with stakeholders and Treasury and SARS. So the confusion has been between these two documents. So the report must reflect on the committee's posture on the fiscal framework and revenue proposals. It didn't do so. We continued to amend the committee report about stakeholder engagements, and then we left with a draft that did not make that clear statement. And then we received a final report, which was ATC'd last night, which said at the end that the committee supports or accepts the fiscal framework as it stands. Now, that was done in retrospect. It wasn't done after a proposition by the chairperson to the members of the committee as to whether we accept or want to amend the fiscal framework.
So it's a procedural issue?
A major procedural challenge. And that procedural challenge has led to a lot of confusion, which is where I think Action SA made a grave fundamental legislative interpretation, because they thought that they are making an amendment to the fiscal framework by making a recommendation that is contained in the report that National Treasury must go and find alternative measures to VAT hikes within 30 days.
Right.
There's no legislation that permits that National Treasury must go and do that. But they supported the fiscal framework at the same time. So when you support the fiscal framework and fail to amend it in accordance to the Money Procedures Amendment Act, it stands, and the VAT hikes within that fiscal framework stand. So your recommendation...
So I'm just trying to follow on from you because it's complicated, the way that you're outlining it. But are you saying that Treasury has no obligation then to go and look for the money to get rid of the VAT hikes?
Absolutely. And also there's no legislation that says that you can amend the fiscal framework and revenue proposals after they've been adopted by the National Assembly.
Right.
The opportunity to amend and remove VAT hikes was yesterday at the Standing Committee on Finance. We didn't do that there. That is where Action SA supported the fiscal framework, and if they intend to support it here today as well, that means that finally that the Parliament of South Africa has adopted VAT hikes of 0.5% this year and next year. The recommendation that National Treasury must in 30 days find an alternative are inconsequential. Because National Treasury...
But there's nothing preventing Treasury from going and looking at alternatives. You're just saying that Treasury is not obliged to.
They're not obliged to. Right. And even if they do find those alternatives, which is highly unlikely, how are they going to imprint those on a fiscal framework which was already adopted? Because there's no legislation that permits an amendment of the fiscal framework post its adoption. So we are saying that it might even be in the best interest of South Africans. We know there's a lot of anxiety around it, but as things stand, there will be VAT hikes in South Africa if this report is not brought upon review, and this procedural mishaps are a mechanism in which we can get the report back to the Standing Committee on Finance and hopefully get Action SA back to its senses.
This is on a technicality, though, isn't it, Sinawo?
Absolutely. It's a technicality, but which is fundamentally important because it means the proper processes of the legislation that guides us as members of Parliament wasn't followed appropriately. And it was an attempt deliberately by the chairperson of the Standing Committee on Finance to sort of steamroll us into adopting this fiscal framework because there was a lot of blackmail going on. South Africans are waiting for a budget. People need their social relief distress grants. But the fact of the matter
those are real concerns because if we don't adopt this budget, if it's not passed today, we're working on an old budget.
But look, yesterday we could have amended the budget and removed VAT hikes, and there were various proposals from the Democratic Alliance, from the EFF, from Umkhonto Sizwe, even Action SA, despite their mishap in legislative interpretation, which bring about alternative measures to generate the 28 billion shortfall that we were trying to get through VAT. So we could have avoided any delay, but now the VAT hikes are here. The VAT hikes will be adopted today. So this procedural mishap is an opportunity for members of Parliament to reflect on the mistakes they made in the Standing Committee on Finance yesterday and present a budget that is going to be pro-growth, pro-jobs, and not have VAT hikes which are going to affect the poor and the middle class disproportionately.
Right. And pro-poor. But the fact of the matter is it comes down to the numbers, and they seem to have the numbers.
Look, it's going to be quite a tight race. I mean, if the Democratic Alliance sticks to its guns, which was to reject the fiscal framework as it was yesterday, and the EFF and Umkhonto Sizwe do the same, the ANC is left with a couple of minority parties which belong to the Government of National Unity and Action SA, which would get them across the line just slightly.
Rise Mzansi is also on board, apparently?
It would get them across the line just slightly to get the simple majority they need to pass the budget. So it's going to go down to the wire. But I think engagement should continue before 2 o'clock to try and speak some sense to political parties that we still have an opportunity to amend this budget if it goes back to the Standing Committee on Finance. And we have to have those engagements. Otherwise, the people of South Africa are going to suffer. You know, in 2018, we were told that it's going to be a temporary VAT hike from 14% to 15% over a 3-year period. It's been 7 years, and now we're getting another VAT hike. So any promises of 30-day reviews are pies in the sky. We need to do it now while we still have an opportunity.
So what's going to be the process now from 2 o'clock? When this session, this joint session sits from 2 o'clock, what are the EFF's next steps? Or are you having those discussions now ahead of that 2 o'clock
We're
start?
having the discussions ahead of the 2 o'clock start. We've written to the Speaker, of course, around the procedural processes we think were violated in the Standing Committee on Finance. But if push comes to shove and we have to participate in a vote, we will do so. And we will vote in rejection of the proposed fiscal framework and revenue proposals and that committee report. And we hope that all political parties come to an appreciation of the legislation that guides us, how it was failed yesterday, and how we still have an opportunity to save South Africans from the VAT hikes.
Sinawo Thambo, thanks very much indeed for coming on. The EFF's spokesperson here outside the Dome, where Iman at 2 o'clock this afternoon is when that joint sitting will be taking place here. It is arguing on a technicality, but we do know that once it gets to the vote inside the Dome, inside the National Assembly, effectively, it's all going to come down to 50+1.
It is a waiting game. As he said, you know, there are still talks happening. This one is coming down to the wire.